So let's now work on these meal items here, and let's make sure that those look the way they should look. For that, I'll start by adding a new widget. So not a screen widget, but a regular widget, so to say, that will be included in another widget, instead of being loaded as a screen. And I'll name this widget meal item, or I'll name the file meal item dart, but in there I'll name the widget class meal item as well. Now, of course, as always, we must extend stateless or stateful widget, and here again it is stateless widget. We will also use stateful widgets later in this section, but here this widget is really just about outputting the meal item data in that list of meals which we're displaying on the screen here. So this is just a stateless widget. And then, of course, here we'll need to get some data and store some data. Most importantly, we'll need the meal. So you should import that meal model file so that you can store the meal as a property here, and of course also get that meal data as input to this widget, so as a parameter. So besides getting and forwarding that key, I'm also requiring this meal parameter, which then is stored, or which value is then stored in this property here. And then, of course, as always, you need the build method where you return the widget combination for this widget. And here for this widget, which will be output in a list in the end, I'll return the card widget, which is built into Flutter and which you saw before in the course in the expense tracker app already. And here in this card, I then will output a child, which will be another inkwell widget, because these meals should also be tappable, because of course later we want to be able to select meals from that list of meals here and then be taken to the meals detail screen. That's why I'm using inkwell here. So here we can already set the onTap parameter on this inkwell widget constructor function, though at the moment it's just an empty function. Later this will change, of course. And then here we also need another child inside of that inkwell, which should actually be a stack widget. And that's a new widget, which we haven't seen before. It's not related to this stack of screens, which I mentioned earlier. Instead, this is a widget that can be used to position multiple widgets above each other, but not above each other as we do it in a column, where they are rendered from top to bottom on a screen, but instead directly above each other, so that we can, for example, set an image as a background and have some text on top of it. That's the goal here, and that is what we can do with help of the stack widget that's built into Flutter. A stack, like column or row, wants multiple child widgets and hence accepts a children parameter, because we will stack multiple widgets on top of each other, otherwise we wouldn't need to use stack. And here we then add all the widgets that should be positioned on top of each other, starting with the one that's on the bottom of the stack. So that's in the background, so to say. And in my case here, this will be an image, which I will display with help of the fade in image widget provided by Flutter, which is simply a utility widget that displays an image that's being faded in, so that when the image is loaded, it's not popping in, which can be quite ugly, but it's smoothly faded in. For that, you also need to define a placeholder that's shown initially. And here I'll use another package, Flutter transparent image, which simply gives us a dummy image, which we can use as a placeholder, which will be transparent, so where we won't see anything, but which will ensure that this fade in animation between nothing and the final image is played smoothly. So therefore here we should install this transparent image package by executing this command here. And with that being installed as a placeholder, we want to display a memory image, which is another class provided by Flutter, a so-called image provider class, which knows how to load images from memory. And to memory image, we pass k transparent image, which is imported from that transparent image package, which we just added. So we have to add this import where we import transparent image Dart from the transparent image package. And with this import added, this global variable here will be available, and this in the end will simply contain such a memory image that is loaded as a placeholder. And then the final image that should be loaded will be a network image, so an image fetched from the internet. And we need that because in our dummy data, these meals actually have image URLs, which are URLs to images that are stored in the internet. So therefore, I want to load the images from these URLs or with help of these URLs, and network image is exactly the kind of class that allows us to do that. Network image wants such a URL, and therefore here we can use that meal, which will be stored in this property, to access the image URL on that meal. And that will make sure that ultimately this image here will be loaded, but it will be loaded in a very smooth way. It will be faded in once it's available after displaying nothing as a placeholder. And of course, you could also display some other image as a placeholder in the beginning, but here I'll go for this solution. So that's the first widget in this stack of widgets. The next and indeed already final widget here should then be a box, a container on top of this image that displays the name of the meal and also some meta information about the meal. And for positioning a widget on top of another widget inside of a stack, Flutter gives us another very useful widget. And that's the positioned widget. Positioned takes a child, like for example here, a container, and it then also allows us to set some additional parameters besides setting this child. For example, we can set top or bottom or left to define how this child widget should be positioned on top of this widget. So for example here, if I set this to bottom 0, left 0, and right 0, like this, this container will be positioned on top of this image. This will always be the case because it's a stack and this widget comes after this widget. And I mentioned before that the first widget will be the bottommost widget and other widgets will be added on top of it. But with these coordinates, I'm making sure that this container will be added on top of the bottom of this image, and it will span from the very left to the very right, so that it starts at the beginning of the left border of this image and it ends at the right border. So there is no distance between the left border and the right border and this container. That's what this says. If I would set this to right 50, for example, I would say that this container should end 50 pixels before this image here ends to the right. That's how you can think of that. And it's best if you simply play around with these values to then see a difference. But of course, to see a difference, we first of all have to make sure that we do display something in that container here. And for that, in that container, I want to add a color, a background color to it. And here I'll use a built-in color with colors and then black 54, which is a transparent black color. So it's not fully opaque, instead it has some transparency added to it. And we could also tweak this transparency here if we wanted to, but I'll stick to the built-in one. And with that we'll have a slightly transparent black background, which I do set up here to make sure that my meal title and the metadata is always readable. Because of course the background images could be very different, and therefore I wouldn't know how to color the text that sits on top of them whilst ensuring that it's always readable, and that's why I'm using this container, which always assigns this slightly transparent black background to my texts. And speaking of that, of course we also need to add the text by adding a child here, which then holds a column, because I want to have my title sit above my metadata. So I want to have two rows, with the first row being my title and the second row being the metadata. I also want to add some padding before working on that column. And here I'll set the padding for this container to edge insets symmetric to have different padding to the left and right and top and bottom. And here I'll simply set the vertical padding to, let's say, 5 or 6, doesn't matter, and the horizontal padding to 44. But these values, of course, are up to you. And now here in this column, I'll set up my children where, as mentioned, the first row will be the title. And of course, here we'll use the actual meal title. And the second row then should be some metadata. So therefore, I'll actually add a sized box between these two rows to have some spacing with a height of 12, let's say. And then below that, I have a row with more children where I have all these metadata items for my meals. But I'll get back to those in a second. First of all, let's output the title. And for this, we can, of course, refer to meal title. And then I'll also restrict this to be no more than 2 lines long. In case I would have a very long title, it would then be cut off. And I want to ensure that the text is aligned in the center, which can be done with help of the text align parameter. So by setting text align here to text align center, I ensure that the text is centered. In addition, I'll add soft wrap true to make sure that the text is wrapped in a good looking way if it should need wrapping. And I'll add the overflow parameter, which controls how the text will be cut off if it needs to be cut off because it's too long. For example, because it would take more than 2 lines. And here we can set this to various options that are predefined on the text overflow enum. And here I'll set it to ellipsis, which makes sure that if we had a very long text, it would simply be cut off by adding 3 dots after it, which looks better than suddenly cutting it off like this. Last but not least, I'll add some styling here, and here I'll define a brand new style. I'll not use my theme here. Instead, I'll define a style where I set the font size to 20, the font weight to font weight bold, and the color to white, like this. And of course, here we can then add const in front of this, and that's how the title should be styled and configured for this meal item. Now with the title added, we can work on the metadata, but before we do that, let's see whether this all looks and works the way it should. So to test this, we can go to our meals.dart file in the screens folder, which renders this list of meals. And here, instead of outputting this dummy text per meal, we now want to output the meal item. And of course, you must add the import to this newly added meal item Dart file in the widgets folder, therefore. And with that added, we have to pass in the meal that is being rendered here. And for that, since we're in list view builder, we access meals. And then we get the index of the meal here as an input, and that gives us a single meal, which is then passed as a value to this meal parameter on the meal item class here. And if I save this now and force a reload, and I pick Italian, I now indeed see my meal here. Now the image first needs to load initially, and as you can see, it does fade in smoothly, but then you see the meal here and you see the title below that. Now I'd actually like to have some spacing around these meals, and for that we can go to meal item again. And on this card we can add a margin. It's a parameter which conveniently is supported by the card widget. And we can set this margin here to edge insets all and maybe add 8 pixels in all directions. And in addition, I'll actually also change the shape a little bit and set the shape to a rounded rectangle border, which in the end allows me to give this card rounded corners or change the border radius with the border radius of my choice. And for that here, in this rounded rectangle border class constructor, we can set the border radius parameter and set this to border radius circular, as we did it before in other places of the course as well, and maybe choose a radius of 8. As always, definitely play around with these settings to get a better feeling for that. Now, if I do that and save everything, you will see that I don't really have rounded corners. And the reason for that is that this stack here by default ignores the shape I might have set up here on this card. To enforce this shape here, I have to add a setting that ensures that any content that would go out of this shape is simply cut off. And this can be done by setting the clip behavior on the card to clip hard edge. And this simply clips this widget, removing any content of child widgets that would go outside of the shape boundaries of this card widget. Last but not least, I'll add the elevation parameter to add a slight drop shadow behind the card and give this card some elevation, some 3D effect therefore. And this is simply an int number where again you can play around with different values. I will simply use a value of 2 here. With that, you can save this. And now you can see that if you reload this, we do have the rounded corners here. Last but not least, on this fade in image, I'll also add the fit parameter and set this to box fit cover to make sure that the image is never distorted, but instead cut off and zoomed in a bit if it wouldn't fit into the box otherwise. In addition, I'll add a fixed height of, let's say, 200 to make sure that we don't have this ugly jump which we otherwise could have initially before the image is there. And now to make sure that the entire width is used, I'll set the width here to double infinity to tell the image to use as much space as it can get horizontally. And thanks to this setting here, it will use this height and this width without being distorted. So with that, this now looks much better.